Close reading. What is it? Well, close reading is a term used or developed by the new critics, who were scholars writing about poetry and also about fiction in the 1940s and the 1950s. And they used this as a term to describe concentrating on the text itself and the dynamics and relationships within a piece of writing that give the piece of writing its meaning. And so, for example, things like imagery, sounds, rhythms, word choices, metaphors, everything that goes on within this text itself. And especially looking at repetitions and relationships that take place from the beginning to the end of a short piece of writing. After the new critics, and so actually going back, the new critics themselves tended to really emphasize just staying with the text itself and not looking at biography or the intention of the writer. They would argue that doesn't really matter. We don't have the writer there to ask them what they mean or why they were using a particular word. We just have to take the text on its own terms and just focus on that. And so the point is to look at this text itself, and this is the place where we might really question them a little bit at this point, to provide a definitive and unified interpretation of this text based on what's on the page. And so the idea that there could be a correct interpretation that is not in some way subjective or shaped by the reader's biography, the reader's response, what the reader brings to the reading, or by the author's intention. So in a way, trying to just isolate that product, the artistic product, as something that just exists on its own terms. So in our own time, there are questions that we've asked about this method, but a lot of the good methodology that was associated with new criticism in terms of close reading has been retained. And in fact, not just in terms of literary scholarship, but also in terms of anthropology, in terms of just any place where we want to look at some kind of a cultural artifact in a really careful and detailed and attentive way, looking at all the ways that it works. And so I'm going to kind of skip over some other things that are in these slides that you can review it in your own time, of just examples of other kinds of critics that you may have heard of, and which, if you are a literature and writing studies major, you will ultimately study, such as deconstruction, reader response, and many sort of what were originally kind of new ways of looking at literary texts that now, in many cases, are really just part of the norm of how we read things. So we normally read things with attention to the layers that are part of the author and the reader's reception, including where they're situated in various aspects of their embodied social identities. So there are lots of other approaches that are involved in looking at literary works, but all of them, whether you're talking about feminism, post-colonialism, queer studies, just about any literary analysis is going to use close reading as one of its tools. And in fact, literary studies is not the only place where close reading is used with regularity. So anthropology is one place that I'm mentioning in terms of something called thick description, which is a method that was, in a sense, developed or pioneered by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. So you're going to see it in other forms of writing that you may have encountered in your college career. So why do we do this? So the big reason to do this is to know more about how a text works. And it's usually for the end result of trying to share with somebody else what you got from it. And you can certainly do this and enjoy it immensely, just as a way of understanding for your own benefit what you got from a text. So it can be actually really fun to unearth layer upon layer of interesting things that are happening, even in a short literary work. But it's also really essential if we want to share our interpretations with someone else on the basis of something else that we share, which is the words on the page. And so I have a little drawing here that I drew actually with my trackpad, because that was all I had when I created this. Showing sort of my way of imagining each of us looking at a poem, and each of us are bringing different things to that page, and then something happens up in our own minds and our experience. So we kind of have our own version of the poem, and so we come together and we have what sometimes are two very different readings of the same poem, and we have that one thing that's in common, and that is the poem itself. And that is our anchor. That's the place where we can find common ground. And we need to work with that common ground if we're going to appreciate and share our interpretations with other people. It's work, it's hard work. We don't usually get it all said the way that we experienced it the first time. It can take some real revision and effort. Some people sometimes think, well, what is all this analysis just ruining what's really fun about reading poetry? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so I've got two thoughts about this. One is finding something that's really not there in the poem, and that you really can't anchor to what's happening in the poem, that's more about this elsewhere that you want to take it to. You know, all of a sudden there's maybe one word in the poem that reminds you of the book of Genesis, to pick a really common example, and your whole analysis is based more on the book of Genesis or some other aspect of the Bible than it is on what's actually on the page. And so at that point, I feel like it can take away from the experience of the poem itself and what's fun about it. But if it brings you back to the poem, then I say it enhances the pleasure of it. It's like getting to know someone that you already love even better. And it's not like you love them less when you know them more. You love them in a different way when you have this knowledge. You have greater awareness in your love. So the last comment is that close reading a little tiny bit of text, which is what I often have you do in my class, it may seem like, well, why are we doing? I think there's actually a really good purpose for just doing this with one little chunk of text, just in and of itself, because of all the reasons that I've just mentioned. But often people use these as part of longer essays and longer studies. And so it's just this important thing that if you're developing an argument about the big ideas that occur in a piece of writing, and the close reading will come in just as a way of development. So it's a means of development of a particular point. It might not stand on its own. But I also think that there's a real benefit to just having these, to writing these and having them stand on their own. And as we work through this, I am going to offer sort of a one paragraph version of what we do with our annotations. And then I'm also going to suggest how you might expand that into something a bit longer that is a lot closer to some of the pieces of writing that I might ask you for in this course. And so I tend to ask you for annotations and then close readings that are pretty short based on those annotations. And then I may ask you for longer close readings that actually expand those initial ideas and shape them into an actual interpretation. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of those things, and I'll post the outcome of my work with this so that you can see where it got to. I want to point out that obviously I've been studying literature for a really long time, and so I am not showing you my work as a model for what your work is supposed to look like, even though I would say that my work here is not based on a thorough study of the poem I'm going to discuss at all. In fact, I've selected a poem I deliberately selected a poem that perplexes me, that I've read before several times, but I really hadn't read in many years when I started doing this, and I still haven't figured out exactly. And so I think it's a perplexing little poem. So I wanted to pick something that I didn't feel completely comfortable with, and also something that I haven't studied in terms of reading what other critics have written about it. So, so I would say that I would not be surprised at all to see each and every one of you write something that is at least as good as what I've got here. Okay, so let's move forward to how do we get started on this? Well, sometimes, and I've said this many times, is doing a free write so that you kind of do a brain dump and you capture all of your impressions and you capture them in a way that is writing so fast that you outwrite your inner critic is a really effective way to find out what you observed when you read something. And there's also, if you want to, you can certainly look at this terminology sheet that I've provided just as a reminder of things to think about if you're feeling kind of stuck and you don't think you have anything to say, or just to extend some of those first impressions a little farther. And so as you'll hear in this tape, I did this in several settings, and I'm still discovering things that I'd like to add in here. So every time you come back to a piece of writing after you spent some time away from it, and this includes your own writing, by the way, you will discover new things about it. Time, which we tend to have not enough of these days, is really your friend in terms of thinking in general, and especially in thinking about something like a literary work that will give you, it'll give you a bunch of things in your first reading, and then many of its later gifts are just going to emerge over time. So it's worth giving yourself lots of time to do this. In fact, I'd rather have you deal with a shorter piece of writing and spend more time with it than to take broad strokes looking at many parts of something long, because you're going to get much deeper, and getting deeper is usually much more satisfying and interesting in terms of analyzing writing. So here are just some questions that you might ask, a reminder of questions you might ask about a poem in particular, certainly other pieces of writing, fiction as well. The idea of who is the speaker here, it's usually, we tend to think it's not the poet, even if it is autobiographical. The self that writes, the voice that you have when you write a story is not necessarily identical to the voice that lives in the world. So and sometimes, often, the voice who speaks is a character of some kind. So think about who speaks as if they are a character of sorts. We sometimes call this a persona in poetry. What tone of voice is it? How do you know? What other things do we learn about the speaker? What's going on with rhymes? Where are there rhymes? Are they inside lines, at the ends of lines? Are there patterns, line lengths, repetitions? Are there repetitions of sounds besides rhyming? So just the repetition of a vowel sound like ooh, you may not have a rhyming word like I can't even think of poodle and moodle, but you might have poodle and oolong, okay? And so you'd have that repetition of that sound of assonance or consonant sounds that repeat. So these are some questions, and again, go back to that terminology sheet if you need a refresher. Look at where your senses are imaginatively appealed to by the poem. Look for those concrete images, and always look for what's there in terms of what seems to be happening, really happening, not necessarily what's symbolized, but what seems to actually be happening. Are there comparisons? Are there metaphors or similes? Are there weird word choices that you have to look up and that maybe seem like they're an unusual choice for the situation, or just distinctive? What else? What do you need to look up in terms of just making sure that you really do understand how this particular word is used by this writer at this particular time? So I'm going to follow this by giving you just a little model of an interpretive paragraph. And it is, it's not necessarily rules for what you have to follow, but it can be a starting place. And it can also be a way to come back, and if you've drafted something, to come back and say, well, did I do these things in what I wrote? And so it can be a nice way to sort of cross-check yourself. I usually don't have things perfectly planned out when I start writing them. I tend to do a lot of messy drafts, and then I go back and do a lot of work in revision. And I strongly recommend that. So this is the poem in its entirety. And so I'm going to suggest that you maybe listen to me read it and then pause the poem and then take a moment to capture all of your impressions. And I'll repeat these instructions in the next screen. A slumber did my spirit seal by William Wordsworth. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. So now is the time to pause the video, reread the poem carefully on your own. You have a PDF of this video so that you can look at the poem carefully, or you could just go back to that screen and pause it there, and then do one of those brain dump free writes. If you want, you can print it out and then annotate it manually, which I think is always the best way. So just a refresher that you're trying to outright your inner critic. So please don't worry about spelling, grammar. Did you say it right? Just try to keep the pen moving, even if you're just writing alphabets at a certain point or drawing circles, and come back to ideas. It really can be helpful to just stay moving, because it's a way of tricking our sort of sense of our own inadequacy to do the job into going away. And so ultimately you will find that you do have something to say, that you did notice something. And then when you're done, put the free write aside. You will come back to it later, but you won't want to necessarily look at it for the next part of the video. So now that you've done your free write, let's look at the text itself. And I would say, do have a printout of some kind, or work with your own copy on screen. And do some marking up. So highlighting, typing, making notes. Note any places where you have point of view shifts, places where the verb tense shift, places where the focus of the poem shifts. And so I'm actually directing these as not things that would be coming up in absolutely every poem, but that definitely come up in this one. So I'm giving you a little guidance. Notice any distinctive or unfamiliar words. There's at least one. And note any places, one that I had to look up again because I couldn't quite remember. I thought I knew what it meant, but I wasn't positive. Note any places that make you, in your imagination, see, smell, hear, touch, taste. Note or smell. Draw anything that you can't figure out. And then when you're done with that, then come back and keep going with the video. So here's what I came up with when I did my first annotation. And so you probably can't even read all of this, but if you'll notice, I noticed a lot of things. And so at this point, there are probably more words on the page in my messy handwriting than there are words that are typed in the poem itself. Questions, observations, but really more questions than anything else. And I highlighted a few things that I thought were interesting and circled some as well. When you finish doing that, I want you to try another layer. And ideally, you'll take a break between these sessions. So it can really help to just focus on one thing when you're annotating something. So for this second session, the second layer, if you will, just think about rhyme scheme, because this is a poem that has rhyme in it. Now, not every poem is going to be that interesting to talk about in terms of rhyme scheme. A poem that's in free verse may have rhymes, but they may not be necessarily in a formal pattern in the way that you'll find in sonnets or villanelles, or just a poem like this that has two stanzas that are set up in a rhyming pattern. So here we've got a rhyme scheme. Let's analyze it. So mark the first rhymed ending at the end of the first line, A, and then keep moving throughout the poem. You don't restart the alphabet anywhere in the poem. So every new rhyme gets a new letter in the alphabet. And when you return to a rhyme that you've seen before, reuse that letter. And here's a little example of it. And now I'm hoping that you, well, this is messy enough so that even if you didn't remember to pause the video before you did that, you can pause it now and then come back to this after you have looked at the poem and applied your sense of what the rhyme scheme is. And so I've got a few things in here besides rhyme scheme, and so I will talk about that next. So you can see that seal is the A rhyme, fierce is the B rhyme, feel rhymes with the first word that's an annotated, seal, and so that's the A rhyme again. Years comes back with the B rhyme. Force is a new rhyme, so it's C, seas is D, course is C, and trees is D. So it's a pretty accessible rhyme scheme to note. There are a couple of other things here. I'm noticing how long each line is, and I'm breaking it down into its syllables. And so it alternates between 8-syllable lines and 6-syllable lines, which not that you have to use these terms, but that those are called tetrameter and trimeter. The other thing that I'm noticing is the pattern in the syllables of emphasis. So the rhythm of the rhythm of the lines, the rhythm of the words. A slumber did my spirit seal. So that's a pretty regular iambic kind of meter, and you can look up what that means. It's not something you'll be tested on. There are also some other things that I note. I note the places where it seems to me that the rhythm breaks a little bit. It's not quite as regular. And I'm also noticing places where there are repeated sounds like rolled round, those repeated R's, that is called alliteration, rolled round and rocks. And there's also that the repetition of slumber, spirit, seal up at the top. So there are places where there's other kinds of sound repetitions as well as these rhythmic patterns. So, and I have a little bit more about what I mean by the metrical pattern that you can review on your own time. And if you get stressed out by it, don't worry about it. Just move on. You can always come back to this, or you can look at it individual slides on the PDF. I think the most fun thing to do in my mind is to just try and do this with your own name and see what is the rhythm in my own name. And I've got examples of this with students. I often have students who have a name that is spelled Andrea, and some of them pronounce it Andrea, where they put an emphasis on the middle syllable, and some of them pronounce it Andrea. So there's an emphasis on the first syllable. So that's that same word, 3 syllables, a different pattern of rhythm, a different metrical pattern. Meter means measure. And so it's about measuring the rhythms. You don't want to get somebody else's name wrong. So it's kind of good to know this about friends, classmates, and students. Sometimes there's variation, but some words are easier to agree upon. And so try this out with your own name, but do not stress about it. And apologies for the pun. And so there are a few more slides on meter if you want to keep going, but feel free to skip ahead to the slide called Putting It All Together. And I'm going to actually just move past these slides with some examples of how you might work with meter step by step. And you can come back to this on your own. We've noticed all these things in a poem. And so that's great. Well, what do we do now? We have a free write. We've got a bunch of annotations. How do we work all this together into something that is a little bit more formal of a piece of writing? And so I'm going to offer 2 samples here. One thing you can do is just try to write 1 paragraph about it, where you're just asserting one thing, and then you're offering an example to explain what you mean. You're explaining the example and showing how it connects to the assertion. And then you're sort of summing up in a way that if I'm learning from you by reading this paragraph, I'm sort of ready to get the deeper version of your assertion or your point by the end. And so here's what I did with this poem in that regard. And this, I would say, this I actually timed myself, or after the fact. It took me about 2 hours after I'd gotten the annotations done and the free write done, 2 hours. And then I came back to it the next day for another half hour. And once I started this process, my brain was working on it the whole time, even when I was not really actively thinking about it, which is a little tip for all of you. Once you start something, your brain will work on it even if you're sleeping or paying attention to something else. So start assignments early and they will go much easier. So assert something specific about the poem. And so I had a lot of different versions of this. So I'm not going to read each one of those, but you'll see that I kept writing it and then I kept changing it. And then I finally got to a version that I felt was okay. In the short poem, a focus on the speaker's altered state shifts to the strange state of a female subject characterized by her lack of sensation in the sensory natural world. So I tried to limit what I was talking about, just really looking at that shift between the focus on the speaker and how he feels to the focus on whoever she is and what she feels and doesn't, and how strange that is in the middle of all the sensory imagery that she apparently is not touching her at all in terms of sensation. So my example of what I just asserted is, well, the speaker seems overpowered or even unconscious because of spirit stealing slumber. She is described as a thing that could not feel, / that's how you show line breaks, the touch of earthly years. Her lack of sensation expands to lack of sight, hearing, and agency, but the poem ends with an image of her being tumbled with rocks, stones, and trees as the earth turns. So it's not perfect, but at least I have an example there. And there's my final thought. While the speaker's altered state sounds enchanted and a bit powerful, going back to the beginning of the poem, no human fears, the female figure who seems to inspire it being the altered state, I guess, seems to be not even dead, but stuck in a permanent state of insensibility. So that is my paragraph. So how would I turn that into an actual essay? I went back to the paragraph and I thought, well, this is a good starting place, but if I actually wanted to share this with anybody, I'd have to bring in a lot more to flesh it out. And I could do a lot more. I could say a lot more that would make this a lot more substantial. Because I'm kind of making an assertion that talks about the whole poem, and I'm just explaining it. I'm offering one little example and then the paragraph's over. So I really want to talk about one poem, a whole poem. Maybe I could do it in a few more paragraphs. And actually everything that I had in that first paragraph bears maybe some expanding. And so what I did was, I added in some details that were necessary. And then I just built it out in various ways. And as I did build it out, I found myself revising along the way. And it was really easy to do that, partly because I hadn't looked at this in several months. And so I could see the places that were awkward. So that's another piece of advice to you. When you're revising your own work, time is your friend. It's also really helpful to read it out loud. You will notice things that you don't notice when you just look at it, and your brain fills in the gaps. And so I won't read this to you, but this is my revised paragraph. It's actually a little bit different than those individual things, but not that. Actually, I think this is pretty close to what you just read. And so I took this one paragraph and I built it out after the thesis. So I took the first sentence as a thesis statement, and then I built out every next sentence as its own paragraph. And then I added some other things. I noticed some more things. I fleshed it out with quotes and details. And I brought in a lot more things about the rhyme scheme and other things, sort of technical issues in a separate paragraph. I am not positive that I integrated them in fully, but that was okay too. So as you'll notice, I went from this first thesis of this initial focus on the speaker and its shift to the female figure to the second sentence that I add on that's really about technical stuff. And so it's really fine to do that. Sometimes you really can't weave them all in together into a nice, neat little package. And if you did, it would probably be awkward and boring. So you do not need to read this on the spot, but there it is. Actually, I gave you the entire thing here, and you can look at it on the PDF. It's not a brilliant piece of writing, but I think it gets the job done. And it's pretty darn short. It's only about 475 words. So that will be something to think about in terms of the word count that I give you in terms of expected length of assignments that I give you. But keep in mind that word counts can vary. And so this isn't necessarily an ideal length for this. It probably could be longer. I could talk about a lot more things in terms of sound devices, I think. I don't even bring my alliteration in there at all. Like my alliteration from the beginning is not included, but it's a start. Okay, so I want to close by saying this is not necessarily, going back to the new critics, this is not necessarily a definitive interpretation or a correct one. I may not even agree with this tomorrow. And I did not do any research to see what other scholars have written about this. They might say, well, they might say something that makes me realize that I missed the boat entirely. But I did try to anchor my feelings about this weird little poem by anchor them to evidence that somebody else could see. And I also did not take on absolutely everything. There are other things that I would probably include if I kept going, but enough is enough for this one essay, which is a word that means attempt in French, essayer, to try. And it was very satisfying to do it. And I really do love this poem, partly because it can't necessarily be sorted out entirely. And I ended up drawing a little picture of what I loved about it, the idea that there is this sense of the earth slowly turning that we don't even feel, and yet she's being rolled around somehow. So visually, it's really compelling to me as well. The drawing is also, I think, a nice little visual of sort of how I feel sometimes in the middle of reading a poem. And so I do have some caveats here at the end that, yes, I have lots of years of training, but I did not do any particular research beyond the poem itself in order to write this. And so it's very much accessible to you. It just takes time. And so depending on what I'm asking you to do, you may not have this kind of time. And if you don't have this kind of time, I won't be expecting a product that is based on a lot of time, but you can get partway there. And I really feel very optimistic about what you will do with whatever you end up analyzing.